I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today for this, our final speaker series session of 2022 and our fourth Lessons in Recovery and Resilience this year. Today, you will hear from three incredible speakers. First, with a presentation by Dr. Julie Kaplow about supporting children and families through reminders of trauma and grief, followed by a panel discussion with survivors who serve and support others through their work with the 720 Memorial Foundation, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and other collaborative efforts. Unfortunately, Kristen Arquiza from Marked by COVID was unable to join us today. We chose to focus on the topic of remembrance, reminders, anniversaries, and milestones in this session because we know that this is an ongoing part of the marathon that is long-term healing. We are hearing from the families in our service populations and so many communities and survivor groups that the frequency of tragedies this year in the U.S. and abroad has been unrelenting and very activating. With the holiday season upon us, intensity is setting in for some. Many of those we work with observed milestone anniversaries this year, both personal and public. Just yesterday was the 10-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook elementary mass shooting. While it is hard to process that it has been this long since that horrible day in which 26 young students and educators were killed, it is even more difficult to process that similar tragedies continue to occur. Across the families we serve, reminders of trauma and grief at different times, activated by different impulses and manifesting in many varied ways, we are here to support all through these ups and downs. Our speakers today all provide valuable perspectives on remembrance and coping with reminders of trauma and grief. For those of you who are seeking support during difficult reminders and milestones in your own life, I hope this session will be a comfort to you. And for those who are attending to others' needs, I hope we can provide some valuable insights to you and learn from your work as well. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our expert speakers and survivors, and thanks to our Tuesday Shielding team who have organized this event, especially Catherine, Nikki, Sally, Sarah, and Kathy. And at this time, I'd like to hand it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Terry, for that welcome and introduction. I'm Catherine Ellard with Tuesday's Children, and I'm so pleased to see all of you today. I want to direct all of our attendees to the online workspace for today's session. We will post a link to that in the chat. We encourage you to use the workspace for discussion throughout the program and to continue those discussions after we conclude. We've posted a few interactive polls, bios for today's speakers, along with some resources and tip sheets from our speakers and from Tuesday's Children. I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Julie Kaplow, who will give a brief presentation and then serve as a moderator for our panel discussion. Julie wears many hats. She is a licensed board-certified clinical child and adolescent psychologist, the executive vice president of the Trauma and Grief Programs at and Policy at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, and the executive director of the Trauma and Grief Centers at the Hackett Center for Mental Health in Houston and the Children's Hospital in New Orleans. She is a professor of psychiatry at Tulane University School of Medicine and is the CEO of the Lucine Center for Trauma and Grief. Dr. Kaplow has provided extensive services to traumatized and bereaved youth in the aftermath of tragedies, most recently assisting in coordinating mental health response in Uvalde, Texas, after the Robb Elementary School shooting. She has also published extensively on the topic of childhood trauma and grief, and has led many grant-funded initiatives to better understand how to enhance resilience in youth exposed to adversity and impacted by trauma and grief. Dr. Kaplow, Julie, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here with this really wonderful panel. And what I thought I would do is give a little bit of an overview of how to support kids who are experiencing grief during the holidays, especially with a focus on trauma and loss reminders. And I'm hoping everyone can see the screen. Yes. Okay. So what I want to do first is just give you a little bit of background about the Trauma and Grief Center and what we do. So we have 4 main pillars, and the first is that we develop evidence-based assessments and interventions for youth who've experienced either trauma and or loss. We also do training and professional education in trauma and bereavement-related topics and interventions, empowering communities to use what we know are best practices to address trauma and grief in youth. We also conduct research looking at children's strengths and needs in response to trauma and loss, as well as the effectiveness of the intervention we're using in different populations. And then our policy arm is really designed to ensure that what we know of best practices for treating trauma and grief in youth is disseminated across the country. And that's something that we're actively working on. And so what I wanted to do first is talk about childhood grief. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, when we're talking about bereavement, we're talking about the experience of deprivation or loss by death. And when we're talking about grief, this is the psychological or behavioral response that arises from bereavement. In other words, bereavement is to trauma as grief is to PTSD. And the reason that's so important is because there have been a number of studies looking at the long-term effects of bereavement on youth, so the act of losing somebody. But there have been far fewer studies looking at grief. How do children actually respond in the aftermath of a death? And we think that's an incredibly important mediator or something that helps to explain how kids will do over the longer term. But first, I want to talk about why we're so focused on bereavement. So bereavement is actually the most frequently reported type of trauma in clinic-referred youth. It is also the most common form of trauma worldwide, even more so now because of the pandemic. And in fact, in the US alone, we have about 290,000 youth who've lost a caregiver due to COVID. It is the most distressing form of trauma among adults and youth in the general population. So if you were to ask anybody, what is the hardest thing that's ever happened to you? The vast majority would say it was the death of my mother, my brother, my sibling, my good friend. It's also the strongest predictor of poor school outcomes above and beyond any other form of trauma. This was a study that was conducted by one of my former postdocs, Ben Osterhoff, who looked at about 10,000 students across the country and found that the sudden death of a loved one was actually the strongest predictor of poor school grades, school truancy, lack of school connectedness, problems learning, above and beyond sexual abuse, physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence. So what we're also trying to do is educate schools and educators about the need to identify kids who are bereaved very quickly and help them in the aftermath of a loss. I also want to just touch on some important facts that we know about grief. So we know that most bereaved children will go on to lead healthy, happy, productive lives. We also know that there is no right or wrong way to grieve and that there is no set timeline for grief. So again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but there is sort of this mistaken notion in our society that after a year that kids should somehow be over it or be getting over it. And we know that grief is not a problem to be fixed. It's a natural part of life, a reflection of the love we had for the person who died. So of course, grief is never going to just go away. It may change and morph over time, but it's not something that we're trying to get rid of. And when we look at children who are grieving, I've had the honor of working with a couple of colleagues, Chris Lane and Bob Pinus, on this theory that we call multidimensional grief theory. And when we look at how children grieve, we recognize that it's not dichotomous. It's not they either have or don't have maladaptive grief. What we recognize is that grief is multidimensional, that kids can be high or low on separation distress. This is yearning or longing for the person who died. They can be high or low on existential or identity distress. This is feeling lost without the person, or how am I going to get through life without the person here? Excuse me. And they can also be high or low on circumstance-related distress. This is being very preoccupied with the way the person died. So I wish I could have intervened, or I wish they didn't have to suffer so much. And we also know that there is an adaptive counterpart to each of these dimensions. So for example, I was working with a young girl whose mother died, and she was extremely close with her mom. This was a 9-year-old girl, and of course was devastated by this loss. But the more that she started to engage in behaviors that she used to do with her mom, like making her mom's favorite apple pie, taking swim lessons because swimming was something they loved to do together, the more she felt connected to her mom in a very different way, but in a very important and healthy way. And that's the adaptive side of separation distress. With existential or identity distress, we hear things all the time from adolescents who say, I don't know how I'm going to get through life without my dad. But we also hear them saying things like, I want to live the kind of life my dad would have wanted me to live, or I want to do things that would have made my dad proud of me. That's the adaptive side of existential distress. And with circumstance-related distress, we see kids naturally gravitating toward wanting to change the circumstances of the death into something that can help other people not have to suffer in the same way. So for example, I was working with a young boy whose father died in a tragic plane crash. And when I asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? He said, I want to be an engineer who can make planes that don't break anymore. We see this all the time where kids will want to become an ER doc so that they can save lives in the way that they wish their person had been saved. Or they're raising money for breast cancer because mom died of breast cancer. And we can even venture to say that some of society's most important inventions and interventions stem from tragedies, like exit doors or seat belts or groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or nonprofits, that are working to ensure people don't suffer in the same way. So the idea here is that when we're working with kids who are grieving, we want to not only reduce more of that unhelpful grieving, but enhance and harness the more adaptive grieving. So these are just a couple examples taken from one of the interventions that we've been disseminating called trauma and grief component therapy. And this is a boy whose father died, and his mom is saying, your dad would want you to enjoy these tickets. Why don't we go to the game together? And he's thinking, I can't ever go back there anymore. It won't ever be the same without him. So we see this all the time where kids will start to avoid doing the things they used to love doing because doing them without the person there is just too painful for them. With existential distress, this is a girl whose father died, and he was her biggest cheerleader. And she's thinking, I don't care about my future anymore. If he's not going to be a part of it, he'll never see me graduate anyway. So what's the point? So she's basically throwing away her acceptance letter. And what we know is that many kids who had goals and aspirations for the future may start to avoid those goals, or may start to not want to achieve those goals because, again, their person is no longer there to support them or guide them through that. And then circumstance-related distress. This is a classic example where this young woman lost her brother to gang violence. And she's thinking, every time I see his picture, I can't help thinking about the night he got killed. It gets me so mad that it's hard to remember the good times. So she may want to positively reminisce about her brother, but every time she thinks about him, she's flooded with those anger-inducing and upsetting thoughts and feelings about how he died, and she just can't hold on to those positive memories. So the question becomes, why is this framework important? We believe that a multidimensional framework is important because different dimensions of grief may actually be more prominent at certain developmental stages. And in fact, what we're seeing is that younger children tend to grapple more with the separation distress, whereas older children or adolescents tend to grapple more with existential or identity distress, which makes sense if you think about the developmental tasks of those age groups. Different dimensions of grief may not be present in all bereaved populations. And in fact, we find that circumstance-related distress is much higher in youth who've lost loved ones to violence. And then finally, and one of the most important messages here, is that different dimensions of grief may require different treatment components. So in other words, the way we go about supporting kids who are really grappling with separation distress may look very different than how we support kids who are grappling with circumstance-related distress, for example. And that's why one-size-fits-all grief treatments don't typically work. They're not typically very effective because we really need to better understand how children are grieving. They can be grieving in very different ways. And so I want to just quickly make this distinction between PTSD and grief. And sometimes in the literature, in the field of psychology, these can be lumped together, that trauma and grief are really the same. And we know that they're not. And in fact, we know that traumatic stress can be easily misdiagnosed in children. And the reason for that is because traumatic stress reactions can often look like anxiety. We know that kids with PTSD often have fears and worries about the safety of themselves, their family, their friends, and they can look anxious. We also know that PTSD can resemble ADHD in kids. Often if kids are very hypervigilant because of their PTSD, they look hyperactive. Or if they're very avoidant because of their PTSD, they look like they're not concentrating. We also see this in depression, where kids with PTSD often have increased irritability, changes in sleep, lack of interest in doing things. And also PTSD can be misdiagnosed as conduct problems. We know from teachers that kids who've experienced trauma may start to act out in the classroom, especially if they're triggered by something in the classroom, and they may become dysregulated and aggressive. And if the teacher doesn't know that that child has experienced a trauma, this is when kids can easily get mislabeled early on and carry that label with them throughout the rest of their schooling. And then finally, we know that kids with trauma often experience what appears to be physical illness, but that's often because the trauma is manifesting physically in their bodies. So they may have headaches or stomach aches. And again, if pediatricians don't know the right question to ask, this can go on for long periods of time where they're not aware, the pediatrician's not aware that something actually happened to that child to produce those symptoms. And so not only do we have difficulty with recognizing this in kids, but we also know that kids can experience trauma and loss reminders, and these can lead to very different outcomes. So again, PTSD and grief have different precipitating factors. We know that what leads to PTSD looks different than what leads to grief. And trauma and loss reminders are a good example of that. So trauma reminders are images, sounds, smells, people, or situations that remind the child of the traumatic event itself. And this is what often leads to PTSD. Whereas loss reminders are images, sounds, smells, people, or situations that remind the child of the absence of the person, that they're no longer there physically. And this is what often leads to grief reactions. And the reason this distinction is so important is because, again, the way we go about supporting kids who are anticipating trauma reminders or anticipating loss reminders is very different. And so we need to be paying close attention to that. So I wanted to just give you an example of what this can look like in a young girl. This was a 17-year-old girl who not only witnessed the murder of her mother by her father, but she actually tried to intervene. And you'll see here that we were using a semi-structured interview for PTSD, so the questions were fairly scripted. But I think this gives a good example of how trauma and loss reminders differ. So the clinician says, do you get very afraid, upset, or sad when something reminds you of what happened? The girl says, oh yeah, screaming, the door slamming, firecrackers. That and seeing or hearing arguments. Whenever I hear somebody fussing or anyone arguing, especially if it's a man, I want to run and just go get a knife. It brings me right back. I get to the point where I'm so scared, I'll kill you if you make another move. I wouldn't mean to do it. It's just out of fear. They could even just be playing, but just hearing that scream, it just makes me feel like I'm back there again. The clinician says, and when these things happen, how much do they bother you? The patient says, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd have to say 20. So you can see here that the reason she's probably saying that it's a 20 is because she's encountering these trauma reminders quite frequently. Screaming on the playground, doors slamming at school or even at home, firecrackers on 4th of July. We know that that's a huge trauma reminder for kids. And so these are things that she's likely encountering frequently, and that is why the intensity can be so strong. And then the clinician goes on to say, and if you tried to stay away from people, places, or things that remind you of what happened, the patient says, I can't go to the mall anymore. I went only one time after she died, and I couldn't go after that. There's a lot of stores and stuff that I like there, and I want to go so bad, but I can't because I don't have my mama anymore. The clinician says, is that because the mall reminds you of what happened? Or she says, the mall just reminds me of her in general. good times and bad times, we always went there together. So this is not a trauma reminder, right? This is a loss reminder because it's reminding her that she doesn't have her mom anymore, that it's too sad to go there. And so again, the reason this is an important distinction is because caregivers, if they know what those trauma and loss reminders are, can better support kids as they're going through that. And that's certainly the case during the holidays, which we'll get to in a minute. I just also want to touch on the fact that just as with grief treatments that require different treatment elements for those different dimensions of grief, we know that trauma-related treatments need to have a separate component for grief. So trauma and grief look very different, and the way we go about treating those look very different. This is one of those examples of an intervention that does that. So you can see here that Module 2 is focused primarily on trauma processing. Module 3 is focused on grief processing. And the beauty of this model is that it can be used in groups or individually. It's been used in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, the Santa Fe school shooting more recently. We've trained the clinicians throughout the Uvalde Independent School District to use this. And we can tailor it according to the needs and strengths of those students, ensuring that they're not just getting trauma-related support, but grief-related support. And so how can adults help youth who are grieving during the holidays? The first idea here is meeting your child where they are. Some kids are going to want to talk a lot about the deceased person. Others are not going to want to talk at all. And so the best thing we can do as caregivers is just simply listen and be present. We know that bearing witness to their pain, acknowledging that this is a difficult time, and leaving the door open for communication is extremely critical. And so not forcing kids to discuss it, but letting them know, I am here if you need me, or I'm here if you want to talk. It's also important for caregivers to recognize that it's okay to be sad in front of your child. And in fact, that models for them what normal grief looks like, that it can be sad, that you can cry, that you can cry for 20 minutes and then get up and have dinner and still be okay. You know, so I know that a lot of caregivers worry about, well, what is that going to do to my child to see me upset? It actually normalizes and validates what they are likely experiencing themselves. We also want to anticipate loss and trauma reminders, knowing that it's going to be hard to not have dad at the dinner table or not have grandmother there. And what can we do ahead of time to help kids with that? Do we want to put a photo of the person at the table? Do we want to make their favorite food for dinner? But we can empower kids to help decide what are the things we want to do to memorialize that person, to make sure that they're still with us in some way. And then trauma reminders are also important, recognizing that what may be a trauma reminder to a child may not be a trauma reminder to an adult. And so that's, again, really, that's another reason why it's so important for caregivers to really explore that, to help kids to know that they can talk about those things. What are the things that make you feel afraid or worried? Or what are the things that make you feel comfortable and happy about the deceased person? And what can we do to make them feel more connected? Which leads me to the next one, help to create connections. So again, kids can have a say in this. How would they like to remember the person? What can they do during the holidays that will help them to feel more connected to that person? And it can also involve writing a letter. We have kids write letters to their deceased loved one. And the important piece here is to have the child write a letter back. So imagining what would the person say back to them. So not just writing a letter and throwing it out there, but really thinking through, what would this person want me to know? That can be incredibly powerful. And then for caregivers in particular, practicing self-care, ensuring that they are getting the help that they need, whether that is through support of friends and family or therapy. But, caregivers are often so worried about their children, especially during the holidays, that they're not necessarily taking care of themselves. And we know that when parents and caregivers feel good and supported, that is when children have the best outcomes. So when do we seek support? This is a question we get from a lot of caregivers. If kids are having behaviors that are really interfering with their daily functioning, so they're really not able to go to school, they're not able to function at home or with peers, that is when we would want kids to have an evaluation. Or if they're showing extreme signs of depression, so if they're tearful every morning, every night, not able to get out of bed in the morning. If their grieving child shows signs of possible PTSD, if they're having nightmares, if they're extremely jumpy and on edge, if they're highly avoidant of even talking about the person, not able to say their name, those are signs that we might want to get an evaluation. And then, of course, any gesture related to self-harm or any mention of suicidal ideation, that would be a major marker that that child probably needs to be evaluated. I want to just mention briefly some resources that we have, and these are going to be up on the house space as well. But the Trauma and Grief Center has a virtual learning library that has freely downloadable webinars for different audiences related to trauma and grief. So for pediatricians, educators, caregivers, law enforcement. And one of the series of handouts that we've created is called The Power of Parenting. This was done in collaboration between researchers, clinicians, and adults with lived experience who are raising children who lost a loved one. And so the idea here is to help parents to talk about different types of deaths of kids, where sometimes you have a loss of words, not knowing how to talk about a suicide death or a drug overdose death, or even a death due to COVID. So we have these handouts, again, that are freely downloadable for caregivers who are grappling with those kinds of issues and have a child who is grieving. And if you are interested in any of the trainings we provide, all of our trainings are free of charge, given that we are fortunately grant funded through both New York Life Foundation as well as Brave of Heart Foundation. To learn more about those trainings, you can hover over that code. We will also put our listserv on house space so that you're able to access information about trainings that are coming up. So thank you so much for your time, and I am going to turn it back over to Kathy, I believe.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that presentation. We are grateful for all your insights, especially those around ways to better support children and families, as that is the core of our work here at Tuesday's Children. So now we'd like to move on to the panel discussion portion of our program today, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Heather Dearman. Heather is a civil service specialist at the City of Aurora and a chairperson at the 720 Memorial Foundation and Spirit of Aurora. She is also a founding member of the Colorado Resilient Life Center and a founding member of Tuesday's Children Survivors of Tragedy outreach program known as STOP. We are so grateful for her voice there. Heather's cousin Ashley was paralyzed in the July 20th, 2012 Aurora Theater shooting. Ashley's unborn child and 6-year-old daughter, Veronica, were killed. Heather and the 720 Memorial Foundation Board are focused on providing support across the nation to communities who have experienced similar tragedy through their Paper Crane Peace Project. The foundation has grown into a resource for advice and guidance in the aftermath of other mass tragedies. She continues to advocate for survivors' long-term needs alongside others in the STOP program and other collaborative initiatives. Heather has been a keynote speaker and panelist at several victim advocate conferences and recently received the 2022 Outstanding Volunteer Award from the National Philanthropy Association. Well-deserved, Heather. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
And our next panelist is Lieutenant Colonel John Bigna. John is currently an assistant professor in the Social Sciences Department at the United States Military Academy and teaches both American politics and military history. He is also a project manager for the Army's Office of Economic and Manpower Analysis. John served in many assignments and deployments in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, to include combat tours in 2 different wars. While on active duty, he was also assigned twice to the United States Military Academy's Department of History, where he taught a variety of courses in American history and military history. He holds a master's degree from Cornell University, specializing in the history of American foreign relations, the Cold War, and the Civil War. John is a surviving spouse of his late wife, Lisa, who is an active duty officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and proud father of 2 girls, Sophie and Olivia. Thank you for your service, John, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to hand it back over to Julie to start the panel.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm really thrilled to be here with both of you, John and Heather. So what I'd like to do is dive into some questions just to allow the audience to get to know you and some of your work a little bit better. So Heather, I'll start with you. I'm wondering if you could share some information with us about your work. I know that we recently observed the 10th anniversary of the Aurora shooting and that you were personally impacted, obviously. And would you be willing to share how you processed that 10-year milestone, as well as more about your activities around the theme of metamorphosis, which I think is just so amazing?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone out there. As you mentioned, my family was directly impacted by the theater shooting in 2012. My cousin Ashley was there, and she was with her 6-year-old daughter, Veronica, and also pregnant, and she's now paralyzed because she was shot, and she lost her 6-year-old daughter, Veronica, and her unborn child. And for the first, I would say, from 2012 to 2015, our family was really focused on supporting Ashley, while all of our family was, and everyone in our family was really dealing with our own grief and, you know, processing of what had happened to us and to our community in such a public way. And it was in 2015 when I finally reached out to our city, because I happened to work there, and asked if they would, they were building a memorial, and they hadn't had much luck raising money or getting anywhere with the memorial. I do think a lot of that had to do with the trial was going on at the time, and the trial finally concluded in 2015, and that's when we had a fundraiser for to build the memorial. And it was a lemonade stand that my 6-year-old daughter had the idea of having to honor Veronica. And I have 5 kids myself. Aubrey was the youngest, and she's closest in age to Veronica, and my oldest daughter Megan is closest in age to Ashley, Veronica's mom. And so it was just very interesting at that time to see the different ways that my children had processed the grief and, you know, everything that had went on up till then. But one thing I did notice was that how our community really came together that day at the lemonade stand to raise money for the memorial. Veronica had wanted to be a police officer when she grew up, and I had asked our chief at that time to make sure a bunch of officers would be there, and he went above and beyond, and they did a procession to the lemonade stand, and they made Veronica an honorary police officer. It was just so beautiful to see how all of them took the oath for her, and they gave my cousin Ashley a badge for Veronica, and she's now our little angel in blue. And at that time, I just really saw how there was so much love and hope out there, and people coming together who wanted to support us, that I wanted to be a part of the board. And I became a part of the board, and we continued to raise money for the memorial at different events at the city. And just to see everyone who would come up to us, even the children, giving us, you know, their change from their piggy bank, I really feel like it really made our memorial special, because it was grassroots and everyone was involved in the culmination of the memorial. Another thing that we had started doing, because sadly in 2015 it seemed like the mass shootings were becoming more frequent, and we realized that when 2012 happened, everyone from around the country and around the world really sent the city of Aurora messages of love and support on banners. And so we decided to have banners at all our events when there was another shooting, and we would have people come and sign them so that we could send it to that community. And what I found was that it opened up a conversation between 2 people. When they would come up and sign the banner and ask what happened, we would share our story, and then they would share a story of some kind of grief that they would have. And so it was really healing on both parts. But our memorial, as you can see behind me, this is the center flight. It is based off of paper cranes that a boy in O'Fallon, Missouri sent us in 2012. He sent us 1,000 paper cranes that he collected from his community, and they wrote notes on them. And when our artist saw that, his idea was to sculpt 83 cranes, and 70 of them are white, and those represent the injured, and then the 13 in the middle represent the ones we lost. We wanted to make sure that our memorial represented all of the first responders, the survivors, the community, everyone. And we really think that he did a great job of doing that. And once we decided that we knew that our memorial was based off of paper cranes, instead of making banners for people to sign to send to communities who experience the same, we started having people come and fold paper cranes with us and write messages of love and support. And then we would put them together on a wreath like this, and we send this to communities who have experienced a loss. This one right here is for Club Q. And so it's just been, once our memorial was realized, our board wanted to pay back the love that everyone has been giving us. And now we strive to advocate for the long-term healing of survivors of similar tragedy, because we know that all the love and support is there when it happens, and that's great. But as years go on, it seems like it kind of goes away. And it's even more important to help people in the long term. For example, my cousin Ashley had struggled over the years, and she's still getting surgeries to this day and still needs help and support. One thing I do want to say too is that we're very big advocates of the ripple effect of mass shootings. And we believe that everyone is a survivor, whether you were there or injured or lost someone or not, or you're a family member or a friend or one of our community. We know that it affected you. And so when the 10-year came up, we knew that it was a milestone anniversary and that the media and everyone in the spotlight would be on us, which milestone anniversaries trigger a lot of trauma for people. So we decided that we wanted to have something for everyone. We have a midnight vigil every year and have from the beginning, where we honor our loved ones in a candlelight vigil at our memorial. And then the following Saturday after the vigil, we've always had a beer fest and a community gathering with chalk art and bands. It's more of a celebration of life and how far we have come. And we did that same thing for the 10-year. And we also added a 5K where one of the survivors from Gateway, he wanted to raise money for a scholarship. And we called it the Hero's Journey because we wanted to acknowledge the path that everyone takes on healing. And we started the 5K across the street from the theater, and it ended up in our memorial. So it was really a tribute to that. And then we had a bigger event where we had a remembrance ceremony and the beer fest and everything like that. And it's kind of like, we know we need to meet people where they are. And some people, and it changes over time, some people need and love to go to those solemn vigils and honor in a deep, quiet way. And some people can't handle that and still haven't come. And so we have the 5K because some people feel like healing where it's not, the trauma and the tragedy is not just right in your face and you're exercising and you're running and being in nature and everything like that. And then our third event was the more celebration of life, where we also had just this amazing immersive art experience called Metamorphosis, which is on the House Base, and you all will have to watch it. It was live on the 23rd, and the orchestra was live there. It was just an incredible, amazing healing experience.
Thank you so much, Heather. That sounds unbelievable what you've been able to do, and just so grateful for everything you've done. And so now I'd love to turn it over to John. John, we are honored to have you here to speak about your experience with grief and loss in the military community. And we thank you for your service, for your wife's service. And just as we do for Heather, we honor your experience and your grief. Can you share some of the work that you've been doing, as well as any specific observations or rituals you've taken part in, as well as any other military families who are also coping with loss?
Sure. First off, let me thank Terry and the Tuesdays Children team and Julie for a great presentation. I'm really honored that you'd have me on this panel. And interestingly enough, one of the services that the military provides was what introduced me to Tuesday's Children and the work that you all do. And I'll touch on that in a second. And, the other note here before I, just give you a little bit of context and background, my heart goes out to everybody that's online here, who's experienced, tragedy and in any way experienced losses, and, my heartfelt condolences. And I think this is one of the things that we find comfort and solace in, is this community, to be able to, talk about these things, to share experiences, and that, no matter when, where, how, the fact that we're whatever community that we're in, that we're not alone. And I think that's one big thing that the military takes to heart. So just a quick caveat to the intro. I appreciate the introduction that you provided. I'm a 24-year military veteran, and my wife, who had never known anything about the military, my late wife, until she married me. It was interesting because we all talk about how people support, your spouses, military spouses support the military member. And my commentary always was, my wife loved me so much she joined the Army, which is essentially what she did, so we could both, carry on a career. And she became I was already in 10 years before the time she joined up, and she went to law school. So she was a JAG attorney, and, a very, very big advocate for, prosecuting crime, especially crimes against children within the military community. And I was actually deployed in the Middle East. I was in the Middle East during 9/11, which was, incredibly surreal, seeing that happen, on the home front. And while I was deployed there, that my wife was back home with our older daughter at that point, and she had been diagnosed with uterine cancer. So it was one of those things that kind of was a major turning point in our life, obviously. So she fought it for 3 years, and then passed away. And I have two daughters at the time. One was 2 and one was 6. And Julie, a lot of things that you had talked about resonated with me in watching some of those, patterns of grief and trauma, and especially how I think they have both at that point manifested themselves in my children, and to this day still manifest themselves. My younger daughter was 2, and my older daughter was 6, and my younger daughter, had no cognitive memory of her mom, and I think things manifest with her a little bit differently today, because she's adopted. She's from China, and I think she has somehow along the way, maybe feels a double abandonment to some degree, but she's very strong. And then my older daughter, who has a very cognitive memory. However, much of her memory was, and to your point about the the smells, the taste, the experience, I think her entire living memory of her mother was being hooked up to chemo machines and things like that. So we've faced those challenges along the way. One of the directions I took in my life was to make career decisions, because as a single parent of 2 young children in the military, I sought to look for stability more than where my career would go, and as you do with the military, I deployed twice while they were, after my wife had passed away, went on operational deployments, and my children had to live with my sister and my parents at the time. So once again, that the family notion of helping, through those, through that trauma and that tragedy. And in the military, we deal with, death and survivorship in a multitude of ways. There's the active duty service member, and then there's the family. And I was in a unique situation because as a dual military member, I didn't have to experience the non-military dependent side of it, because I was still in the military. All those services and things were still available to me. I didn't have to push. I didn't have to pull for them. Because I already knew how to navigate the system, which is a lot different than what really the preponderance of survivors do experience. In the military, we are an enormous family. the community takes care of its own. I like to highlight two interesting notions. We have the Soldier's Creed, and we have the Military Child's Creed. And in both of those, the Soldier's Creed, one key term is "I will never leave a fallen comrade behind," and that's, you know, no matter what happens to that comrade. And I think the analogous point, which the Military Child's Creed was fashioned off of the Soldier's Creed, the Military Child Creed says, "I will never leave a fellow military brat hurting." And military brat's a term we use for kids who are in the military, move around. And I will stand beside them at all times. So there's this notion of family, and there's a lot of things that the military does, and where I've been involved with, there's kind of formal organizational constructs that the military supports, and it emanates from the military. Then there are just a variety of, you know, private functions that support the military as well. And going back to my earlier point of how I got introduced with Tuesday's Children was through one of the elements of the military called Survivor Outreach Services. And that is a connective organization within the military that, you know, tries to keep a link with all survivors, dependents, families, whether they're still associated with the military or not. So the West Point community has a very strong survivor outreach services, and there's the organization exists all across you know, the military footprint, installations all around the world, and they are that connective tissue with the military. Once you get over, you know, the initial loss, the survivors who have to go through all the administrative items and everything, which is really the first piece of that. And the first piece of it is what we have this extensive function through Survivor Services called Casualty Assistance Office. And really, when there's a military casualty for whatever the reason, that is the priority event. That is the priority of the person assigned to that, you know, to that family, to those survivors. And they help the family navigate through this very complex and emotional time where there are, you know, there's the personal side of it, but there's also the military, you know, the military administrative side of it as well. Benefits, getting the service member to, you know, to their final resting place, those types of things. I know with my own experience, we were stationed at Fort Leonard Wood, and my wife is buried here at West Point. So there's the things you do at the installation. Then there's, you know, escorting the service member to the final resting place. And many of you have probably seen that, witnessed that. You know, Dover, Delaware is the reception point for service members who come from overseas. So the Army, and I speak from the Army standpoint because that's my experience. The Army, you know, enormously prioritizes that casualty assistance function, and then moving on to the survivor outreach services, the SOS. And then we also have like the Army Community Service, who has these programs as well. And the three try to nest together and link together. And some of the private organizations that do things on a regular basis. And this will lead, I think, to some of the follow-on questions or ideas. Many of you probably heard of several of these organizations. I work with Wreaths Across America, when we talk about remembrance, the Veterans Day flag placing, Memorial Day flag placing, folds of honor, all these types of things. And some of my own colleagues and classmates have started foundations like Children of Fallen Patriots, who take care of, you know, service members, children going to college and higher education and things like that. So once again, highlighting that family aspect where you are a community and there's things that you can, you know, where you can find solace in that community, but there's also things that you can't find solace within that community, because as you know, as much as you are a team and a family, this is still an enormously individually personal you know, process as well. And you highlighted that, you know, exceptionally well, Julie, this whole idea, you know, and I wanted to just kind of emphasize, I wrote this down because I you know, your point about everybody grieves and heals in their own way and on their own timeline, you know. So I thought, you know, as blinding flash of the obvious that may be, that's essential for people to know. And there's really no right way to do that. So, we all have to kind of be given that space. I've done some larger studies for the Army because part of my position here, in addition to being a professor, it's also I do enterprise level projects for the Army, to include one of the recent studies we did was looking at how to reorganize the casualty process with casualty assistance officers and survivor outreach services, how maybe we can gain efficiencies, how we can perhaps gain more continuity, because that leads to the point where once again, my experience being an active duty soldier and then a retiree, and I still work for them, I have that connectivity, but at some point the survivors and the family have to get detached from the military, even if there's a certain amount of time the Army allows you to continue to live on post, and those benefits never leave you, but at some point you have to move on, and you have the surviving immediate family members who you still have to have that connectivity. But then you can imagine over the years, the thousands of soldiers who might not have what we call like immediate dependents, like a spouse or children, and their survivors become their parents or their family members, and you still have to have that connectivity, and that becomes a lot harder. So some of the work that I've done is helping the Army, conceptualize, are we doing it correct the way we have the organizational construct now, or how else can we gain efficiencies to make sure we are taking care of everybody, and going back to that soldier's creed of never leave a fallen comrade behind, and allowing the military children say, I'll never leave a fellow military brat to hurt or leave them alone. And once again, I want to emphasize the military brat is an endearing term that the military uses. Personally for myself, jointly between my late wife and myself, we moved 19 times. So you're always picking up and setting up things. So for me to make that conscious decision, the last, really the last 7 or 8 years of my career to stabilize my kids as best as the Army would allow me to do, was extremely important for me to have that stability, that predictability, and that that continuity. Did I do everything correct? No. Did I make all the right decisions all the time? No. But I always kind of knew I was fortunate to have the community behind me to be able to weather through those and maybe pick up where I was experiencing shortfalls, or maybe not doing things exactly the way they best could be done. So I know I've talked a long time. I just wanted to give you that context, and I'll let you move on. So.
No, thank you so much. And your perspective is so incredibly helpful. Even, just to even learn more about your experience and that of the military is incredibly helpful. So I want to turn it over now. I'll ask both of you this question, but we are obviously hosting this event during this major season, and we know that it can be particularly difficult to deal with grief during the holidays. We may be reminded of what we or our loved ones have lost, and may feel alone as we watch others celebrating what is meant to be a time of joy. So Heather, can we start with you? Are you willing to share some of the tools you've used or advised others to use during the holidays to support their own grief process?
Sure. I think what resonates with me right now is that you have to give your own self grace to feel maybe not so happy during the holidays. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm going to cry today. It's been hard because all my kids are out of the house, and just that it's the 10-year milestone, and that's when Sandy Hook also happened, was in during Christmas time, and that was just yesterday. So this year I feel myself feeling very, very sad about the holidays, and so thanks for the hugs out there. I see you guys. But what I did was I watched a lot of Christmas Hallmark movies. I watch them every night, and I find myself looking in the background at all the decorations they have on TV, and I went way overboard in my house this year, and I have lights everywhere, and it gives me a little bit of joy just to feel the visual, tactile beauty around me. And, just really look out for the people who are there and offering support. Even though you're feeling down, sometimes it's hard to ground yourself and try to come out of that grief. But you'll always know that there's someone around you who notices that in you. And even if they're just sitting with you and being present in the same room, just, hopefully you connect and feel that energy back and forth, and it gives you a little bit of hope and peace. I noticed that all throughout these 10 years, whenever I have had an incident where I'm trauma triggered or feeling down, like somebody always comes in at the right moment at the right time, or I'll get an email or a card from another community that says, "Thank you so much for those paper cranes. They meant the world to us." And it reminds me to keep going, and that the best thing that you can do is, be kind to another person. And you may not know it at that time that you've affected them in a good way, but just rest assured that any small act of kindness that you do will grow into more acts of kindness. So, my usual advice for people who are feeling down or sad around the holidays is find something where you can give back, whether it's a Christmas card, or even if you're at the store and you're helping someone with their groceries or letting someone in line behind you that only has one thing. I mean, those little things add up, and it comes back to you. The love always comes back to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you for your vulnerability. I think there are so many people listening right now that have the exact same experience and know, not the exact same, but are obviously distraught over the holidays. This is an incredibly difficult time. And, one of my mentors used to say, you need to feel it to heal it. I think sometimes the tendency, especially among the families that we work with, is to want to numb the pain, want to sort of numb out. And the bottom line is that we can't selectively numb. So when you numb the pain, you numb the joy. And I think what you just demonstrated is so critically important for people to understand, that we need to be in touch with those feelings in order to feel both the joy and the pain of loss. So thank you so much for sharing that. So John, I'll turn it over to you with really the same question. What has helped you get through the holidays?
I think one of the things, obviously, and it's not only the holidays for me, but one of the things I tried to do with even the number of times we moved afterwards was always, rightly or wrongly, I kept the house or the way we had things set up, just like, Lisa would, pictures, things like that. So my kids didn't, it was that continuity again. It's not like it's this radical shift and all of a sudden, mom's not where the pictures, and they grew up as, in that sense that, hey, this is how we had it. This is when we lost mom, this is how things were. These are the way we did things. And even going into the holidays did the same thing. Like whatever we did, we did it in the same fashion, whether it's being with family, family coming to visit us. And once again, understanding that you will feel sadness, you do, and you did feel sadness, as did family members, but also talking about it. And it wasn't taboo that your family member is not there. It was, let's talk, let everybody remembering the great things and what a great woman she was. And that helped, especially for my kids, understanding what other people thought about, their mother as well. And I think those things were extremely important and helpful over the years. And then, of course, some of the other events that I do, Reads Across America is a huge one. And a step back, one of the things that we often, do with our service members is, memorializing them in a variety of ways. And, doing the wreaths, doing the flag placement, my kids have done that over the years. If they're not here when I do that on those days, I send them pictures and we send it around to the circle of friends, and they understand that, that's a part of the holiday. That's a part of what we do. You're not here physically, but you are never not here. And I think we approach all those holidays the same way. I mean, for me personally, I think for me the hardest time is around my birthday, which is pretty close after because it was right at that time when Lisa finally, when she passed away. So I still and this will come out in some other questions later, but I think not treating the loss as it's a taboo subject, and don't, because the more comfortable, at least I found, talking about it, the more comfortable my kids were about talking about, especially with family, especially with friends, and especially around the holidays. The more I don't necessarily know if it's accepting the right way, but I think it enabled them to transition better moving forward. And to me, I found those things very helpful.
Thank you so much, John. And you bring up such an important point, especially with kids, thinking through that very tricky balance of, holding on to those important traditions during the holidays as a comfort, but also recognizing the need to create new traditions and new memories and creating a new normal. And I think that's always a struggle. So just really appreciate your thoughts about that. So moving on to the next question, I know that each of you are working professionally to guide others through peer support, and yet you've both been personally impacted by trauma and grief. So given the heightened frequency of tragedies in the news and the media recently, how do each of you cope with taking in that kind of information? And what strategies have you found to be helpful for your own service populations navigating those more public reminders? And I'll throw that back to Heather.
You're right. That is a tricky one because I was personally impacted, but I feel like through my experience and journey and growth through the 10 years, I have learned to notice that my service population is, I guess I feel like I'm more open to meeting people where they're at and letting people share and be open rather than trying to think I need to fix it. A lot of the times it's just people need to talk and they need to, just feel like they're not alone and that someone can understand. I think in the mass shooting survivor community, we're really lucky to have the Rebels Project peer support online, where people from all the different communities can just talk about their feelings and know that everyone will understand without judgment. But it has definitely been hard this year for how frequently it's happening. And it's so interesting to see the different ways that, or different incidents affect people different ways. Like someone might be really affected by Uvalde, especially my family, because it was children just like Veronica, or rather they're more affected by Club Q because it was a hate crime. And it's I think the most important thing to us to think about is that everyone grieves. Every trauma is a trauma to that person. There's no comparison of trauma. So it's hard when people will come up to you and they say to me, your cousin had it the worst. She was paralyzed and she lost her 6-year-old. So, my story isn't as important. And we really just remind them that, you are important too, and your story is valid. And the more you share about how you're feeling on this day, the better you're going to feel.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly helpful. And so, John, same question for you. With all of the tragedies that have been so public, what have you done to help yourself and others get through that?
It's a very interesting and poignant question for a couple of reasons. One, as military members, we anticipate that's always a likelihood, that's always a possibility. Unlike Heather's experience, we should never have to think that that's a possibility under those circumstances. So I think, once again, it's that community, it's that ability to know that you, or at least maybe the comfort to know that you're not going to be alone, and your service will take care of you, even as a survivor. And I think what we do a lot, once again, the different activities, the wreaths, the things we do for our own friends and colleagues, soldiers of mine that had been killed, things like that, touching base with families, my classmates that have been, killed in action and things like that, where we're always communicating so that the family knows that, that their service member, this is the impact they had, and the expanded, circle for which they, touched in so many ways. I know one of the things, that I've done for my late wife is that I have a memorial award at the military academy, because she was also a law professor here, and every year a cadet with it's a peer selected award for resilience, and every year a cadet gets awarded that. So that's keeping that memory and that and that spirit alive. And once again, I think it's, as maybe cliche or trivial as it might sound, this idea of never leaving a fallen comrade behind, and knowing that your servicemen, and in the military, we do have this ability to regularly recognize those things. We do it through Veterans Day, we do it through Memorial Day, we do it through, one of the big things in the process of losing a service member is that memorialization. At the unit level, more than I care to remember the numbers that I attended and when deployed in Iraq, and however, that's the immediate thing that takes precedence over whatever else is going on. You memorialize it, and they become, a part of the unit and the familial history. That is part of the story. And then we, as the leaders and colleagues and soldiers that serve that person, you continue to carry that on. So in that sense, that community is already there, and you understand that's the lifestyle, that's the role you take on, and you don't forget. I think there's a large degree of comfort in that to family members, as much comfort as that could possibly be. So once again, very different than Heather's experience, very different than, the COVID experience and those things like that, because we understand the risk we take on. You don't expect the outcome for these other situations.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the COVID experience, since our other speaker couldn't be here. I love that she is trying to establish memorialization for people lost to COVID, because that's the same thing. COVID affected everyone around the world, and loss is traumatic on its own. But when it was something like this, like a pandemic where the whole world felt it, I think people who lost a loved one to COVID, and to be able to be memorialized in a certain way, I mean, that's just so important.
Yes, thank you, John, and thank you, Heather, for bringing that up. I do think it's worth touching on the COVID-related losses, because I think, what we're seeing with children who've experienced deaths of caregivers due to COVID is that it's almost like a disenfranchised kind of grieving, because the world is ready to move forward, and the world is ready for the pandemic to be over. And with that comes sometimes not a lot of understanding or compassion for those who have lost loved ones to COVID. I will just share very briefly that we were treating a girl whose mother died of COVID. The girl acquired COVID at school, came home, and then 2 weeks later, her mother died. And she literally said, I killed my mommy, which was absolutely heartbreaking. And I think so much of what's happened with children who've experienced these losses is that there is a ton of self-blame, a ton of shame and regret and self-blame that is not always being addressed. And I think It's something that we as adults absolutely need to pay attention to, because of course we don't want any child to believe that they were somehow responsible for these types of deaths. But it's something we're seeing time and time again, and in the kids that we're treating. So I just wanted to raise that because I feel like as a community, we can do a lot better to be able to support their needs in the aftermath. So on a related note, we know that social isolation can be a major risk factor when people feel isolated, and that community and peer connections can be such a positive protective factor in dealing with trauma and grief. But of course, sometimes it can also be helpful to take time independently, individually, on your own to heal. So how can those who experience trauma and grief ensure that they are using healthy coping strategies when those reminders surface, such as during the holidays or during anniversaries? And I think I'll go back to John to start with this one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I might not be the best person for that because there's a lot about me that I like to, you know, I like to do things on my own. I've never been afraid to do those things on my own. Even sometimes, in grief, and in joy, but once again, I think you hit this in your presentation, Julie, this idea of understanding to some degree and meeting folks on their own terms as to where they are in that process, but also recognizing, because there's things I could recognize about my kids, or if there were friends or colleagues, if it had been another fallen service member, that you instinctively know about them because you're close to them, that you can maybe discern, is this a an abnormal amount of wanting to be alone and loneliness. So almost like recognize that and taking it to a point where if you have this innate feeling that that's a little bit, then you start to engage, but you're still giving them that space to be able to, be in their own thoughts and things like that, because we all do need that time and those instances. I just think being very aware and being very perceptive about those things is important, because once again, we've hit this time again. Everybody grieves differently, and a longer amount of maybe isolated grieving isn't necessarily bad if it's this person, and that may be a norm and something that's more helpful than being surrounded by folks and constantly are you okay, this and that. So I think once again, knowing the family member, knowing things about them is that measure or that gauge where you say, okay, I'm going to give you just enough space. Now I'll come in and, is everything okay? So on. And I've done that obviously not only with my kids, maybe sometimes not always the right way, but even with my colleagues and other friends and, former, soldier and service members' families and things like that. So I think for me, that's the best way I think I can articulate an answer to that question.
Thank you, John. Heather, what about you? How do we sort of strike that balance of coping either individually or collectively? How has that gone for you?
Well, I am the type of person who likes to be around people and share. So I think what came to my mind is how differently each of my children coped with the tragedy through the years. And it became, since they were all in different stages, as a mom, it was really hard to navigate and how to treat each one of them. But as the shootings started happening more frequently, I would ask each child, that we have a thing now when one happens, sometimes I would call one of them and they would be upset that I called because it triggered them and they didn't want to know about it. And then I would decide the next time it happened, I wouldn't call, but then they would say, why didn't you call me? It hurt me that you posted something, but you didn't talk to me. So for example, one of my daughters, we just know to text the emoji a butterfly to each other. And if she wants to respond and wants to talk about it, then she will, continue to open up about it. And so it's just different with each person, like you said. for myself, I know that I love to be outside and in nature and feeling the sun. And so, you know, if there's a trauma that happens and none of my kids are wanting to talk about it, I will just go outside and go for a walk or go talk to one of my neighbors about just small talk and not what's going on. So it's just really interesting to think about how each person has a different way of knowing what their self-care is, but it's important to make sure that your loved ones are practicing self-care, and that could be something different for everyone.
Thank you, Heather. And I really love that idea of butterfly. I think it's such a great example of how we can empower our kids to allow them to choose when and how they talk about it. But giving them, you know, sort of that open door. I just love that idea. So the next question, and this might be our last question, but are there any specific milestones that you have observed in your own grief journey or that of someone close to you that you would feel comfortable sharing? And John, we'll go back to you to start with that.
Yeah, I think, you know, interestingly enough, I talked to my kids about this last year, and, you know, several of my, you know, close friends and everything. I think for me, one of the biggest milestones, you know, obviously we hit these, you know, certainly the day Lisa passed is one of those things annually, and that's always there. I think for me, the you know, it was really odd, but last year when I surpassed the number of years Lisa had passed compared to the number of years we were married, to me that was a pretty interesting and significant milestone, because last year we'd been married 16 years when she passed away, and last year was 16. So now this year is going to be 17. But the day after that, it was like, okay, now, you know, she's been gone 16 years, and 16 years in a day. I passed that milestone, and I had to do, you know, I did a lot of reflection, thinking about, you know, all those other milestones that she, you know, she missed, like, you know, kids' graduations and all those things. I think of all the things that happened to us as a family over 16 years, and thinking about, you know, eternally in my mind, and, you know, as much as especially my daughter, completely different context in the way, you know, when Lisa passed. But my mind, you know, Lisa's eternally 37, and, you know, I'm 57 now, and it's like I was thinking about all those things in between, you know, and I think that was a huge one, you know, hitting that break point there, and then thinking about, you know, okay, in that time, you know, kids' graduations, all these types of things, and, you know, thinking about what would she think about how Sophie and Olivia are, like the paths that they've chosen, you know, how they've turned out, those types of things. And, you know, that was a big thing that weighed on my mind at that transition point. So I think probably that would be the biggest one I could think of most recently. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure that so many others have had that experience of thinking about, you know, that gap of time and what was missed during that time. Thank you. Heather, what about you? Any milestones you'd be comfortable sharing?
Sure. I would like to share about my oldest daughter, Megan. As I said before, she was the same age as my cousin Ashley, and so she had a really hard time when it happened, because she went through the trial with Ashley and everything, and she was going through a time in her life where she was abusing alcohol, and she was very, I don't want to speak for her, but seemed very bitter and upset about everything that would have to do with the 720 Foundation or anything like that, and wouldn't come to any of the events. But when Las Vegas happened and we had a banner to bring them, she decided to go on the trip to deliver the banner. And that changed her life. She recognized that she gave grace to others who were not necessarily at the shooting, but like the people at the fire station. The admin had told her, you know, oh gosh, that was a horrible day. And Megan was telling her, you know, you have a right to be upset too. And so Megan found that in herself. that she should give herself the grace to be upset. And so anyway, she was able to process that, and her sober anniversary this year was, I think, five years sober. And just last week, she went with the Giffords Foundation to the National Vigil in Washington. And so back then I was still so worried about her, and I wanted her to find the love and the light and the community that was going on around her, and she just didn't see it at the time. And then to see her now this year participating and being an advocate for something, it's just everything I could have ever hoped for. And so I want to tell any parents out there, if your child is struggling right now, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and they will process it in their own way.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I know you've been such an amazing role model, not just for your own children, but for others who are grieving, and you know, really transforming that tragedy into something powerful and meaningful. So thank you. I know we only have a couple minutes left in this brief time. I'm hoping maybe John and Heather, if you want to share any resources or websites that you think would be important for the audience to know about. And I can start with John.
Yeah, I don't have anything queued up right now, but I think somebody in the chat may have put something about survivor outreach services. And once again, there, you know, that's installation specific, but it's a, you know, a national or an organizational level entity that the Army supports. There's ACS, Army Community Services. The CAO is not an organ; it's a process, and it's a position that's held. And then, you know, for military folks, a couple other things, as I noted, you know, Children of Fallen Patriots is a resource for survivor children to go to school. And then there's also you know, college scholarships and things like that. There's Folds of Honor, there's Wreaths Across America, all those types of things that you continually remember and honor, you know, our fallen service members.
Thank you, John. Heather, what about you?
Our website is in the House base. It's 7-20memorial.org. I also want to let everyone know about the Rebels Project. Any survivors of mass shootings, you know, whether you're the survivor or if it was a ripple effect of you, the Rebels Project is a really good resource. I know that folding paper cranes is very cathartic, and I would encourage you all to fold a paper crane, write a message of love or support on it, and send it to us, or give it to somebody who might need some love and hope. I once heard a story about someone that someone told about a paper crane, and how, you know, the folds are like the scars that you have from trauma, and you know, they're a part of you, but you can turn them into something beautiful and healing, because without all the folds in this paper crane, it wouldn't have turned into something as a symbol of hope and peace.
That's amazing. Thank you. And then I'm also putting in the chat our Trauma and Grief Center's website. As I mentioned before, we have a virtual learning library with webinars on topics related to childhood trauma and grief, as well as the power of parenting handouts, as well as our research papers and empirical articles that talk about the work in this space. And with 2 minutes left, I do want to turn it back to Sally. And thank you so much to John and Heather. I thought you offered some really great guidance and advice today.
Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, to Julie and to Heather and John. This was just a wonderful webinar, and I'm just so glad that everybody could be here. I encourage everybody to visit HouseSpace if you haven't already and continue the conversation there. We will be sending an evaluation out to everyone, and we will be sending the recording as well. And if you have additional questions for the speakers, please feel free to put them in the chat on HouseSpace, and we'll try and keep the conversation going. And wishing everybody a peaceful holiday season. Thank you everybody for joining us.